So everyone, thank you again for joining us. This is a webinar on learning about the GUTC Pledge, or the Grantmakers Unite for Trans Community Pledge for Foundations. I'm Alex Lee. I'm the project director for the GUTC initiative. And joining me today, and we're going to do more introductions later, is Christina Wirtz, also with Funders for LGBTQ Issues, and Luis Ramirez, who is also going to be, who's with our organization as well, and is going to be handling the tech aspects of being on this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into some slides. I'm going to share screen right now, and we're going to also talk about how the functionality of this webinar works and how you can be interacting with us today. All right, so here's the screen share. Here we go. Okay, so again, this is the GUTC Pledge webinar, specifically how community groups can use it in your fundraising. And this webinar has a couple of neat features. So one of the things I wanted to make sure that everyone knows how to do and get some practice hopefully doing today is using the different controls up here. So this should be up in your upper left-hand corner. And there's a couple of features. We're going to be doing a Q&A at the end of our program. So as we are talking, you can input questions into the Q&A. So there should be, if you click on this button, it'll open up a window and you can plug in questions as we go, and we will return to them at the close and we'll answer the questions. There's also a chat function. So if you click on this, a chat box will open up. You can chat with any of us as the panelists as well as with the other attendees. This is a good place to ask, to comment or to respond to things. If you have a question that you like us as panelists to answer altogether, the Q&A box is a better place to put that question. We're also captioning today. So we have a closed caption typist right now, Tony. Tony is on our call with us and is actually writing everything that we're saying as we're saying it. If you need to see the captions, go ahead and click this button and it will open up. If you are somebody who doesn't like to interrupt, and right now we have the mics muted so that interruptions are a minimum, but you can raise your hand. So if you click this box, a little graphic will pop up on our screen that shows you have a little hand waving. That means you want to speak, and then we can work to unmute you and you can speak. There'll be times in which we are going to ask for people to speak up. Okay, so those are our main controls. We are recording, so that's just making sure everyone understands that there's going to be a recording after this, sent out to everyone on this call, as well as people who RSVP'd who are not currently on the call. We also have a polling feature, so we'll be some moments set aside to ask you to give us some input. There'll be a pop-up box on your screens that will open up that Luis is going to be doing for us when we have questions to ask you. And again, if you have help, or if you need help accessing the webinar, anything related to technical aspects of using the webinar, you can actually use the chat box to reach Luis, chat to all panelists so Luis can see it, or you can text Luis directly, and this is for folks who are on the phone. Luis's number is 626-270-1956. Again, that's 626-270-1956. So that is a US number. Okay.
One quick thing to add on the Q&A, you can see what other people have asked, and if you'd like, you can upvote those questions. So if there's something that you have the same question, you can give that question a thumbs up, and we'll know that multiple people are curious about that, and we'll prioritize those questions that have the most volume.
Yes, so you don't have to keep repeating anything. Okay. All right, so now better and more thorough introduction. So again, my name is Alex Lee. I'm the project director for the GUTC initiative, otherwise known as Grantmakers Unite for Trans Community. And I can do a little quick introduction of myself. So I have been in your shoes before. I used to run a group called the TGI Justice Project, which is now headed up by the wonderful Jenna Johnson and her team in San Francisco. And this is a nonprofit that works with trans folks who are in prison and jail in California. So I had had the experience of starting up a nonprofit, a trans-specific and very, unashamedly trans-focused organization, and understanding how difficult it is to actually fundraise, especially when you're dealing with foundations who have a variety of understanding or total lack of understanding of who trans folks even are. So in this role now, I have the privilege of working primarily with foundations to educate them to basically learn and be better allies to trans communities. But this webinar was definitely created, and we're doing a few other projects to support trans-led groups, whether they are 501c3 nonprofits or not, to be able to access foundations and foundation funding in a little easier way. So that's where I'm coming from for this. Christina, do you want to introduce yourself some more?
Sure. I'm Christina Wirtz. I'm the Vice President of Engagement and Philanthropic Outreach at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. I've been at Funders for almost 6 years now, but like Alex, before that, I was at a trans-specific nonprofit. I worked at Transgender Law Center for 5 years and started at TLC when there were 3 staff members, and fundraising was a huge part of our work. And so similar to Alex, I understand the position that many of you are in and have had some difficult conversations with funders over the years and understand sort of what it takes to help funders see that trans issues cut across all foundation priority areas. I always felt like as an ally to the trans community and as a gender nonconforming person, it was sort of my job to stand in the gap as much as possible and take some of the sometimes terrible questions that program officers had. And so I feel like, I have some empathy and understanding for the situations that some of you may be in with at site visits and with program officers. So I bring that perspective to this work. And I think both Alex and I try to keep ourselves rooted in perspective and understanding how GUTC can be useful to all of you.
Yeah, that's what we really want, is to have this initiative be useful. So the goals for today are these 3 bullet points. I don't have to necessarily read them all to you, but they essentially are about introducing Funders for LGBTQ Issues, us, the organization, as well as the GUTC Pledge and the GUTC Initiative to you all. Give you some tips and advice on how trans-led groups can use the pledge and also help from our organization to your fundraising. And then get some information from you all about how you might want to use the pledge, as well as how you want to give us feedback and just more information about how it's working for you, how you're able to access foundations and grant makers with the pledge or without. We just like to hear how things are going. Okay.
Great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Funders for LGBTQ Issues. I know not everybody is super familiar with the organization. So first, what we're going to do is a little poll. I'm going to launch this poll now for my fellow panelists. So take a moment if you are on the Zoom interface and answer this question: how familiar are you with Funders for LGBTQ Issues? You never heard of us before. You've heard, or Grantmakers United for Trans Communities. You've heard about both of us, know a little bit. You've heard about us, used our research and resources. You're very familiar, or you're a huge fan. I suppose we should have added one that is constructive critic as well, and remain and willing to be flexible. So I'm just going to let these trickle in for a quick moment. It looks like most of you have participated. So we're seeing a little bit of a bell curve. Most of you have heard either about Funders for LGBTQ Issues or GUTC and know a little bit about our work. Some of you haven't heard about us at all, and a couple of you have used our resources. So a healthy bell curve there. All right, I'm going to turn off this poll. That's helpful to know going into this. So a bit about us. Alex, if you could go to the next slide.
Absolutely.
So Funders for LGBTQ Issues, despite our name, we are not a funder ourselves. Rather, we're a network of foundations, and we're a membership-based organization. So our members are foundations, and we work to increase the scale and impact of resources for LGBTQ communities. And we always do that with an explicit racial, economic, and gender justice lens. So we do this work in a handful of ways. We're trying to increase resources for the community, and we're also trying to ensure that those resources are distributed to the community in a meaningful way. So our work, before I share sort of how we do it, a little bit more about what we do, we work within the universe of people who are already funding LGBTQ issues to help them be more social justice focused, to fund trans communities, communities of color, communities in the South, folks who need it the most. And then we also work with foundations who have never funded LGBTQ issues before. We call those folks LGBT funding curious. And we help bring those people in to, into the community to start funding LGBTQ issues. We do this in a couple of ways. We host convening, so we do a couple of different conferences a year. You may have heard of Funding for. It's a conference for LGBTQ grant makers who are supporting our communities. We also bring our funders together for collective action. So members will contact us and say, hey, I noticed in your research that funding for queer communities in the South is super low. How can we work together to change that? And we'll convene a working group of funders to partner, to pool resources, and to develop a program around that. We do outreach and support services. So that's the work to bring in new funders, where we help new funders see the intersections between their specific funding priorities and LGBTQ communities. So if you're a health funder, we can meet you with research about health disparities for queer and trans communities. We can help you see, if you're a place-based funder, where there are queer and trans folks in your community that can use your support. And then we also do trainings for foundations. And then sort of the underpinning of all of our work is our research. Every year, you may have seen our annual tracking report. Every year we put out this big report that shows where money is coming into the field, what foundations are supporting LGBTQ issues, and where that money is going. Philanthropy does not have any sort of natural transparency attached to it. Foundations, they need to list it on a 990, but don't need to give very much information to the world about where their money is going. And we believe that transparency is really important to a healthy ecosystem for LGBTQ organizations. So we put out this research every year, and we use that research to guide our programming, and we're able to see where sort of funding within the LGBTQ community is concentrated and what communities, geographic areas, issues might be underfunded and can use some support. So that's a bit about what we do. If you've got any questions about that, feel free to drop them into the chat box, and we can follow up on that. And Alex, I'll kick it over to you to share a little bit about GUTC.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That was a great background and introduction to funders. So sorry, I'm a little distracted because we have a few people just trying to access, and I'm trying to hook them up with Luis. So, all right. So a little bit more about Grantmakers United for Trans Communities. So we are an initiative of funders. So it's like a little project within Funders for LGBTQ Issues, and we're relatively new. So this is a project that's essentially been around, was in the planning stages in 2015, but really came into being in the late 2017. This is our mission. Our work is essentially I like to sum this up and say our work is to essentially transform and deepen the relationships that foundations have with trans communities. By the way, when we're talking about trans communities today, we're also including gender non-conforming as well as non-binary people. I just want to make sure that that's understood, that we're using trans in the expansive way we understand it to be. So our work is to do two things actually within this set of goals. Two projects that I have are a GUTC fellowship, which is essentially a leadership and professional development fellowship for trans, gender non-conforming, and non-binary people who are working in philanthropy. The idea behind that is so that we can help them advance in their careers so that they can hopefully start changing the power dynamics within philanthropy in a positive direction for trans communities. Second thing that I'm working on is this GUTC pledge, and this is a movement from funders to essentially get funders basically we're mobilizing funders. We're asking funders to commit to do concrete things to support trans communities, which they may not have been doing before. All right. I did want to also say that there are people involved in this besides us. So the GUTC program itself was being planned since 2015 by the working group. We call them the GUTC working group. You can see here, this is a partial, just screenshot list of the members. There's actually 20 members. So if you go to our website down here, you actually can see the full list. I want to really underline that this initiative was started by trans folks who are working in philanthropy. I have to say, when it first started, that was really just a handful of people. Fortunately, things have changed a little bit, and that there are more trans, gender non-conforming, and non-binary people who are now working in philanthropy, so the working group itself has gotten bigger. But this, from the beginning, has been driven by trans folks in philanthropy responding to the needs that they are seeing, both as professionals in the field, as well as the actual funding and the lack of funding to trans communities in the United States. Okay. So I want to talk to you about now the pledge. So this is what we asked you to come to this webinar for. So the pledge, and this is again still a screenshot of just the 4 main components, but if you go to our website here, you can actually see the whole thing, including who's already signed it. And that's very rich in terms of information. I'll explain to you a little bit more about how you can use that information in the next couple of slides. So first thing I wanted to say, the purpose and the strategy for the pledge is to, Christina can actually fill you out in a little bit more on, because Christina worked on it back in the day when it first started. So Christina, go ahead.
Sure. So the pledge is our primary organizing strategy to bring new funders into this space and to help funders who are committed to trans issues be vocal about it and give them some specifics about what they can do to support trans communities. So it's a sign-on campaign for foundations to indicate publicly their support for trans communities. I will say that while it might not seem like a particularly cutting-edge strategy, in the world of philanthropy, this is actually quite a bold strategy. There have been a handful of strategies in philanthropy, a handful of pledges in philanthropy. Some have gone well, some have not gone well. But we decided that we wanted to take this risk, that Funders for LGBTQ Issues had built up a substantial amount of social capital over the last 5 or so years, and that we were ready to use that social capital and spend that social capital on trans communities that were so drastically underfunded. So the pledge asks foundations to sign on and express their commitment to the well-being of trans communities and take 4 specific actions, which Alex will tell you about in more detail in a moment. I'll note that the pledge has a very sort of bringing people in kind of tone. It's more of a call in than a call out. This is kind of the culture of philanthropy. It's a very polite culture. It's a very sort of folks want to feel good about what they're doing and want to be able to express publicly that they're doing good in the world. We wanted to kind of take advantage, to be honest, of that desire to feel good about doing good and ask people to make real solid commitments about doing specific things for the trans community, rather than just saying, yay, we love trans people, and not taking any action after that. So this is sort of an accountability tool to ask foundations to indicate their support and take specific actions. So Alex, do you want to share with us a bit about what those specific actions are? Oh, you're muted, Alex.
There's always a fun thing with these webinars, be muted and talking. Okay, so there are 4 components to the GUTC pledge, and they're articulated here. So we are essentially asking foundations to sign the pledge to commit to these 4 things. The first is to basically educate, continue to educate. So participating in trainings and professional development opportunities to learn more about trans communities in their own areas of funding. So we're not asking them to start brand new trans programs. That would be great, but that's not necessarily what we're asking them to do. But we are asking them to look at what they're actually doing already to figure out how they can support trans communities in those funding priorities. Second thing, improving the recruitment and retention of trans and non-conforming staff and board members. And again, this is about hiring, it's about HR, it's about making sure that they actually are hiring from our community, and if when they are, they're actually being supportive of the community on staff. Thirdly, increase their grant making. So this is where the rubber hits the road, really. We're asking them to commit more resources, more dollars, and sending them out the door to trans communities. We are asking them down here, as you can see, with a commitment in particular to trans-led organizations. And finally, we have a commitment to publicly express their support for and solidarity with trans communities, especially at this, in this time in history where there's a lot of public attacks on the trans communities. We thought this was an important thing to ask foundations to do, using their voice to advance our rights and make sure that they're seen and known as people who support trans groups and trans communities, and why that's important for them to use their voice that way. So, for example, as part of number 4, we are about to start working with our network of the signatories to the pledge, as well as other people that we are connected to within Funders for LGBTQ Issues, to put in public comments for the Section 1557 rollback attempt by the Trump administration. So that's an example of how we can make number 4, how we expect people to be able to meet number 4 through the pledge. So we have currently 40 signatories. So let me give you a little history on how we started this. So it launched officially the end of March with 25 signatories. Since then, we're now up to 40. So even beyond the initial launch, people have still expressed interest. People are still calling and emailing us and asking to sign on, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want. We want to build momentum, and we want to basically make this something that people want to affirmatively sign on, seek out and actually sign on, talk to their board members and trustees, people who hold the power in their foundations, and have conversations about why it's important to sign on. The current signatories you can see again on this list here. If you go to our website, you can see them all. We put their logos up there as a signatory. As you can see, if there's anybody you've already been talking to, people who you've never talked to on that list. The current signatories are actually all working with me. This has been going on for since March at least, but essentially I'm working with them all one by one to find out what exactly they're needing to meet the pledge components. Some of them need actual training. They need to hire people to come and do trainings for them. Other ones need people to come in and do a full-on HR review with them. So they have different needs, and they're in different places. So we are trying to customize the support that we as funders can give to these foundations to actually meet these 4 components, as well as hold them accountable to meeting them as they go along. And again, as Christina mentioned earlier, this is more like a hand up. We're trying to help them do this. We are not using this as a way to kind of attack or malign foundations. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about kind of the approach and the voice around this. So, okay. So in terms of future plans, we're continuing to get foundations to sign on to this. We have some plans to do another forum. So what we did in preparation for the launch in December of last year, we held a funder forum, essentially an informational session, an all-day information session for funders in Oakland, California in December. And we're going to, and that featured about 20 trans folks from the community who are doing different work from different organizations all over the country, both actual 501c3s as well as just informal community groups. And, talked about their work in front of a selection of about 50 funders or people from foundations. So we want to do something like that again in the coming years and potentially other parts of the country, highlighting specific work in different regions. And we are also going to be working with more funders that are a little further out from us to kind of keep spreading the word and getting folks who really ought to be taking this pledge, because there's so many overlaps between what issues impact trans communities and works that they're working on, to sign the pledge as well. So essentially, this is a live campaign. We are continuing to roll it out. We're continuing to get signatories. Okay. So where are we now? So we want to talk about now how foundations, how nonprofits, and community groups can actually take advantage of this pledge. So the first question, though, is another polling question we have for you. Let's hear some common challenges you've encountered when trying to raise money from foundations. I know, and I've talked to some of you individually, you all have stuff to say on this. So I'm going to turn on the poll right now for this question. Give everybody a minute to answer. Yeah, and you can select as many as are applicable. This is not a single choice. Okay, I think some of you are selecting all of them, which makes sense. Right. Okay, give it about 15 more seconds. Okay, I see some folks are also clicking the last one, which is the not having 501c3 status. I'm glad that we have folks on this call who are not 501c3s. Okay, so I'm going to close the polling. All these questions that you guys checked or y'all check, these are really common things that we hear from foundations, or sorry, from groups all the time about how hard it is to get money from these institutional funders, these foundations. So these are all things that we talk to foundations about. And these are things that we, the pledge can be sort of opening conversations around these issues. So we're doing it on our end, but on the nonprofit side or on the group side, here are some ways you can use the pledge to kind of address some of these things. So for example, you can use the pledge itself as an outreach tool. So again, if there are funders that you are trying to access, and a number of you check the box, the whole difficulty actually making contact question, this is a good sort of reason to reach out to funders who you may not have ever talked to before, or reactivating a conversation that maybe you had started with the foundation that then just kind of died off. You can tell them, hey, there's this movement among foundations called the GUTC Pledge. Have you seen this document? You can show them the website. You can show them who else has signed it. And so it's a good way to set up those conversations as a reason to reach out. It's also an opportunity to find internal champions. So what we mean by this is that what we've noticed when we're working with foundations is that there's usually like 1 or 2, maybe 5, depending on how large the foundation is. But people who do actually care very, very much about supporting trans communities. They may be trans, they may have family members who are trans, or maybe queer. So they care a lot about it, but they're having some trouble accessing folks who are a little higher up to get their input and their buy-in on actually prioritizing this. So one thing that you can do is use the GUTC Pledge as a way to find these internal champions. So when you do the approach with foundations and you send this pledge out to staff members who you may have had a better relationship or better contact with, or were more responsive, you can then, this is a tool for them to actually use to bring it up to their superiors. So it's a way to help them, give them an actual concrete action item to engage people who have more power and more seniority in their foundations. You can also use it as a way to acknowledge funders. So I know that a number of you have galas or parties or some other celebrations that you do every year. You also, some of you give awards. This is a way to kind of use sort of the encouragement, sort of carrot kind of mentality. If folks sign this pledge, like say you're talking to a funder or you've been working with a funder and you see it, they signed the pledge, this is a way to say, hey, you can use your power to acknowledge them either in these awards that you give out or other shout outs you want to give to say thank you. And it sort of encourages that good behavior. And it also allows foundations to essentially show off to their peers, their other foundations, that they're doing this. And they love to do that because it really puts them in this kind of model role, which they really like. So that's one of the kind of psychology of working with foundations that this pledge is set up to really access. We'd also love it if you could share with us how funders are doing with this pledge. So as you are talking to foundations with this pledge, and as you are following up also, the foundation, the signatories already, because they're expressing already that they want to fund trans communities at a higher level, you can approach them too, especially if you've never talked to them, you can approach them too. We'd like to hear how that's going for you, So this, the pledge can be a tool also to work with us in terms of figuring out how we can better support the foundations and the funders to be more responsive and to actually do the increasing funding that we want them to do. Okay, and I would like to share this over with Christina to talk a little bit about a few caveats. Oh, you're muted. Now your turn to be muted. Okay.
Every damn time. Okay. A few notes on what the pledge is not, because we want to be realistic about what this can and can't do. One note is that philanthropy is a slow moving beast. And so if someone signs on to this pledge, it doesn't necessarily mean that money is going to flow immediately and all of a sudden, you're going to get grants that you didn't apply for. And they're just going to be handing out big dollars to trans communities. Some might, some may say, we've signed on to this, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to issue some new grants right away. Others are going to take more time learning about the community, understanding the intersections with their priority areas, and making grants from there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that money will flow immediately, but that is the ultimate goal, is increased resources for trans communities. The second is that this isn't a punishment tool for foundations. It's like Alex said, it's a carrot rather than a stick. We're not using this to shame or call out funders. We don't have a sort of second list of funders that have not signed the pledge. Rather, we're using this psychology of praising people for what they are doing and then trying to meet them where they're at and push them a little bit further. Unfortunately, it's not a guarantee that foundations that have signed onto the pledge will follow through. We're committed to supporting them, to holding them accountable, to finding ways through peer pressure or other ways that we found, other strategies that we found that work with funders, to have every signatory take meaningful action for trans communities, but it's just not something that we can guarantee, but we are doing our best. And then the last caveat that I'll share, which is an important one, is that if a foundation does not sign on to the pledge, please don't take that as an indication that they don't support trans communities or they aren't interested in learning more about trans communities. In fact, we have some major funders of trans communities, some of the top funders of trans communities, that simply have a organizational policy of not signing on to pledges, or are anonymous foundations that don't want to take a public stand or don't take public stands for anything. So even if you are interested in approaching a funder and you look to see if they're a GUTC signatory and they're not, don't take that as an indication that they don't want to hear from you. So with that, given some of the ideas that Alex shared and some of the caveats, I'm very interested in hearing from all of you. Other ways that you'd want to use the GUTC pledge, ways that you are thinking about that this could be useful, or if you've started using it and you've talked to foundations about it, what advice can you give to other folks on the call about how this can be a useful tool for you in your fundraising? So Alex, I believe people can either put this in the box, which is down at the bottom of your screen, or you'll unmute people. I don't see a way to call on people who've raised their hands.
Yeah, so if you click on the raise your hand box at the top, I can see your little graphic pop up saying you need to talk, and I can unmute you. And yes, you can also write in the chat box, and we'll read those out loud.
Great.
We'll give a few minutes for that. Sure.
So feel free to share with us ways that this can be useful to you, or ways that it has been useful to you. And that's fine if we've got more questions than answers at this point, if folks haven't started using this as a fundraising tool yet.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have the Q&A in a second as well. We can talk more then.
All right, last chance to share any ways that this be useful to you that we haven't mentioned. All right, so let's move on to a general Q&A. I'm happy to answer, Alex and I are happy to answer any questions you have about the pledge or do some strategizing. To kick us off, I actually wanted to address some of the common barriers that you all mentioned and ways that we can assist in those common barriers. One of the things that rose to the top was that it's hard to determine what foundations might be interested in funding your work. So one of the things that we do at Funders for LGBTQ Issues is collect data on what foundations are supporting. And we put out an annual tracking report that lists the top funders of trans issues, top funders of issues that intersect with trans issues. So for example, we have a list of the top folks that are funding anti-criminalization and incarceration work, or folks that are funding sex worker rights, folks that are funding health for LGBTQ communities. And so we have lists of all those foundations, and we're happy to brainstorm with you about who some of those funders might be. You also mentioned that it's hard to make contact with staff to introduce your organization. One of the things that I mentioned that we do is we host conferences and convenings with funders, and we try to bring in nonprofit leaders to participate in those conversations and try to maintain a diversity of nonprofit leaders. So the more that we know about the work that you're doing, the more Alex and I and other folks at Funders for LGBTQ Issues are in the loop, the more that we can help get you in front of a funder audience. So I just wanted to name a couple of sort of specific ways that we can help out. Someone asked how exactly can the list of funders be accessed? Two ways. We recently put out a infographic on trans funding that's available on our website, and I can drop a link to that in the chat box there. And that has a list of top trans funders. You can also reach out to Alex or I or someone from our research and communications team and ask sort of, the more specific your question, the easier it is to find data on who's doing that funding. So for example, if the question is, who do you know that's funding anti-incarceration work for trans folks in Louisiana? We can splice our data in that way, and there's probably like 3 funders that are doing that. The more specific we get, the more narrow it gets, but we can access that information for you. So you can either reach out to us or take a look at the tracking report or the recent infographic on trans funding.
We have some questions in the Q&A box. So let's see. We have a question from Pearl asking, I don't yet understand how the GUTC pledge works. Is the cash flow going to, I think the question is the cash flow going to funders or to the nonprofits or the groups directly? So yeah, I can clarify that. So the idea is that the foundations that we're talking to ask them to sign the pledge will fund the groups directly. So we're just there to make sure those connections happen, educate funders so they understand and see the different opportunities within the trans communities that they can fund, so that they actually start doing that. So the money will go out directly to the groups. So Pearl, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to either raise your hand or input more questions in the Q&A box. There's Pearl has another question. I'm in the process of forming a business to create jobs for a QTPOC community. I'm seeking funding for startup costs of the umbrella. What resources or connections to resources would you have to help make this possible? And where could I get more information? So one of the things that I've been doing is talking to different groups all over the country about this exact question, about where they can find funding, who's a likely source to tap. So Pearl, I would invite you and anyone else on this call to set up a meeting with me, and we can have a conversation on the phone, and I can be more specific with you and getting you the resources that you're looking for. So that my email address is actually listed here at the bottom. It's just alex@lgbtfunders.org. Feel free to reach out to me there. Okay, so that's been. Christina, do you have any comments on the one from Lewis, perchance?
That question is, it's a challenge for us because we don't provide direct services, yet provide invisible support to those that do. Therefore, we don't fit into conventional foundation rubrics or outcome calculation tools. This is the sort of thing that we hear quite often, particularly from trans organizations and trans-led groups, many of whom are doing pretty unique work that is responsive to the community, that doesn't fit into a neat foundation silo or bucket. It's one of the things that we're always battling with philanthropy is, we're thinking about those common barriers that you face in fundraising. I was reflecting on my fundraising days and how often I heard, oh, we don't fund by identity, we fund by issue area. So we only fund health, we don't fund LGBTQ people. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? We have huge health disparities. We only fund direct service. We don't fund people who support direct service. I'm not sure I totally, with limited information, I don't know exactly what you do, but the gist is that foundations often have pretty rigid guidelines. What we're really trying to do with GUTC is educate funders about the unique way that trans organizations, trans-led organizations operate when in a community that is so underfunded that folks are trying to do everything, right? A policy organization, no matter what, is doing direct service. A direct service organization, no matter what, is having to address policy issues and systemic change. So, everybody's doing organizing, everybody's doing, direct service like food access and things like that many nonprofits aren't doing. So we're trying to educate foundations about the diversity of work, the sort of holistic nature of trans work. And if, Louis, if there's a specific foundation that you're interested in approaching and want some help strategizing about how to do that, we're happy to have that conversation with you and get a little bit more specific. Alex, do you have anything to add about that?
No, just to say that I mean, that is exactly what we're trying to do. This is an issue that we're running into with foundations, is that they just don't understand the history of trans communities and our work. And for example, they don't know that much about how much HIV and AIDS impacted our community, and therefore how much HIV and AIDS work is actually intersectional and part of organizing that the trans community does. So we do have those conversations. I would also say, Louis, that everyone else who has this question on their minds, this is a great piece of feedback. So if you're running into a foundation and you're like, you know what, you seem on paper this makes sense, like they should be funding us, but they don't understand because we don't fit into their rubric or their understanding of what their change that they're trying to fund looks like. That's a good thing to take over to us to see if we can have a conversation with that funder, or at least with you, to figure out ways to strategize how to talk about your work. So for example, one thing that's come up among funders, which is a new sort of framework, it's not new to trans communities, but it's new to funders, is this idea of healing justice. And you can imagine for us, that basically means all of the mental health stuff that we do in addition to the political work, the artwork, the cultural change stuff, the stuff that basically takes care of our souls that we need to do in order to do any kind of organizing. That stuff now is being visibilized and called healing justice so that funders can actually see it and take it seriously. So that stuff like that is happening in Foundation Universe, and we'd love to connect you with that kind of language and those ways of spinning your work and making it so that it's more understandable to people who don't know the community very well.
Yeah, I see a big part of our job as being sometimes a translator between foundations and folks that are doing grassroots work and helping everybody kind of understand the language that each other are speaking and make sure that resources really are flowing to folks who need it.
Okay, and we have a few more questions now coming in, which is awesome. Okay, thanks, Louis, for sending us your information. I have a question from Zahara. We apply to foundations where the applications are open to all those whose work align with their priorities. However, many foundations whose funding priorities align with our work requires invitation to apply. What strategy should we use to gain invitation to apply for those funders or foundations? Now, Christina, you want to take the first stab?
Sure, it's a tough one. Philanthropy is all about relationships. It's all about knowing program officers, knowing folks who know program officers, trying to get things across people's desks so that they pay attention. So a couple of tips. One, like I said, keep us in the loop on your work because we do have the privilege of a lot of access to program officers. And we really try to use that privilege as best we can to represent for the community. So make sure that we're aware of your work. Two, there's lots of reasons you can reach out to a program officer short of an application. So for example, if you have a short video that your organization has produced or a report or an event to invite them to, reach out with something other than an application to say, I'd love for you to be aware of our work. Here's a sample of what we're up to. And then maybe wait a couple of days, wait for a response, and then ask for a meeting, and even an informational meeting. So there's things that you can do that aren't quite, can I apply, asking if you can apply, but instead sharing information about your organization. And I know that it can feel sometimes like shouting into a dark void, but it is a little bit of a numbers game. And the more that you're getting your organization out there and in front of people, the more they're gonna know about it. And then invite an application. And I will say, I have been pleasantly surprised with the way that foundations invite applications from groups that they may not have heard of before when they first become aware. So it does happen. They're not just inviting the groups that they already know. They are looking for, many foundations are looking for new grantees, especially in this area where they're being, they've signed onto this pledge and they're wanting to support more organizations.
Yeah. A tip that I found super helpful when I ran into this problem when I was leading TGI Justice Project was I would find out who their other grantees were, so the ones who already got funding from them, and ask those grantees if we had a relationship with them to put in a word for us, basically. So that's a way to leverage connections you already have in the community. So if there are other organizations, trans or not, that are getting funding from them that you're friendly with, this is a nice request to ask so other folks can help you out to kind of get access to those people. Okay, that was a great question. So we have a few questions here from Ms. Banks asking, how do we find fiscal sponsorship? And then how do you get your name out there if you're just starting a new 501c3? So those are great questions. These are actually fairly technical, and it kind of depends on where you live, the size and scope of the work that you want to do. So I would actually say for this question, it would be great if you could email me directly and I can have a conversation with you and connect you up with a couple of different resources. If folks don't already know about Trans United, I would suggest everyone look them up online. It's the Trans United Fund. It's now run by Darnisha Duncan Boyd, who used to be at Take in Alabama. And they actually do provide fiscal sponsorship services for trans-led groups. So I would recommend reaching out to them too. Okay. What else we got?
I also want to mention one of the things that came up in the polling question was 3 folks mentioned that they don't have 501c3 status, and that's been a barrier to funding. Folks may already know, but I think it's worth saying out loud, there are a handful of initiatives that are specifically supporting non-501c3 trans groups. So the Trans Justice Funding Initiative is Trans Justice Funding Project is an important one to take a look at, as well as Third Wave Fund. They support emerging organizations with capacity building grants. They do long-term support and they don't require 501c3 status. And then what was the third one? The Fund for Transgenerations at Borealis Philanthropy. I'm actually not recalling, Alex, if they require 501c3 status. They do. So for that one, you do need to be a 501c3, but they support smaller grassroots organizations and have many grantees every year. So Fund for Transgenerations, Trans Justice Funding Project, and Third Wave Fund are great places to start.
Yeah, through those 2, Trans Justice Funding Project and Third Wave, in the chat box, so that's there for people to look them up. They are fantastic. Trans Justice Funding Project and Third Wave are both run by trans folks, which is amazing. So they are very, very helpful, and they totally understand the situation that a lot of groups are in, especially the ones that are just starting. So they not only can they provide funding and leads to funding, but they can also help you figure out how to do the 501c3 corporation if you want to, and get some resources around there. And Lewis just added, yes, the Fund for Transgeneration, this is a clarification, that's right. Fund for Transgenerations at Borealis Philanthropy doesn't require you have a 501c3, but does require fiscal sponsorship at least. So if you're not a 501c3 yourself, but are fiscally sponsored by an organization that is, then you can qualify for funding. That actually is true for most foundations. I can't say all because I don't know all of them, but the vast majority of foundations, even if you yourself don't have 501c3, having a fiscal sponsor that is pretty much enough to satisfy that requirement. Okay, and then Pro had another great question about the needs and services to fill for trans and QTPOC communities and figuring out how to learn about those things. So if anybody wants to see more research kind of outside, and this is great, you know, in terms of reference for all of us, like what's going on in different parts of the country, for example, you can take a look at the Trans Community Survey that the National Trans NCTE, National Coalition for, what is it?
National Center for Trans Equality.
There you go, NCTE. They're wonderful. They're based in DC, and they've done these national surveys, essentially finding what those important needs and services are that haven't been filled. So that's one place to look. There are other also region specific. So for the Campaign for Southern Equality and TLC recently put out Southern related reports on what the needs and unfilled unmet needs are in those areas. So I would suggest taking a look at those to get a little bit more information. And Pearl has added, some things I've heard are too much drama and infighting, too much tea between their members, yeah. And then they avoid resources as a result, that's right. We need help. We do need healing, also need jobs, shelter. This is definitely right on, Pearl. What else could we benefit from? These are great conversations I think the community needs to keep having. We're at a point now where kind of the the stuff that has hurt us in the past, especially the sort of in-community drama, is really not helping right now. It's actually making things much, much worse. So, this is something that we can, hopefully put folks together to have a conversation more about. I know, for example, Ms. Major and her project, the House of Gigi down in Little Rock, is actually looking at this by doing retreats for trans women of color in different Southern communities to actually confront this sort of drama and infighting and gossiping and shade that has happened, sometimes going back decades, to the point where community members don't even remember why they're fighting. So that's by the way, this work, if you are doing this kind of work, this is what funders are now understanding is healing justice, okay? There's ways to talk about stuff that we've been doing all along in ways that they understand now. Okay. Any other questions? By the way, this is great, the questions people have been putting in here. Thank you so much.
And feel free to raise your hand and share your question out loud if you're
able, yeah.
Don't feel comfortable typing it out.
And I also want to point out for folks on the phone or who can't see the Q&A box, Lewis Mitchell also said, also as an FYI, we provide fiscal sponsorship to quite a few small trans organizations. So that's awesome. Please follow up with Lewis if you're interested.
And Lewis mentioned before that their website is transfaith.info.
I'm going to put that in the chat box. We are also going to be, by the way, sending documentation of this webinar to all of you. So that will include the chat text. Jaden asked, this is what I'm working on. Okay, so in reference to what we just talked about, in terms of the community infighting, this is what I'm working on now with the Black Trans Wellness Collective, the need for healing justice. Awesome. Yeah, this is something that, we've identified. People in the community know we've been needing for years. So I'm really happy that more and more projects are taking this on.
Also, if folks aren't aware, the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice has been playing a real leadership role on the need for healing justice funding, particularly in trans and queer spaces. They put out a report recently that we can link to here, and they're really doing a lot of work to try to help funders understand the need for healing justice. It's another place to take a look at for potential funding. Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice, and they fund the entire LGBT community. And again, they fund smaller organizations. I think the budget cap is $250,000 for them.
Yeah, they have a new report. Go to their website, and you can also Google this healing justice and see what comes up. It's a great and enlightening way to explore. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. Any other questions? Okay, Ms. Banks asked, how do I contact someone in the group? Good question. If you email me, I can then find out if that person would like to share their email. That's one thing that we need to kind of ask permission for everyone before we do that. Great. I'm glad this is helpful. Thank you, Sarah, for letting us know. Thank you, Jaden. And thank you, Lewis. Oh, yeah, thanks, Christina. Christina just put in the Australia link for the Healing Justice Report. And they're another great funder to get to know. They were actually, I think, were they? They were one of the first grants that TGIJP ever got was from them. So they were a very early supporter of trans groups. Oh, so Pearl, it's actually, Pearl's asking us to repeat the organization that has the research and the survey for trans needs. So that's the National Center for Trans Equality. I will type it into the box, chat box. Yeah, so NCTE for short. They've also been around for a good number of years and are one of the larger trans-led groups, civil rights groups for us. Oh yes, Pearl asked for, okay, so Pearl's asking, there's one you mentioned after House of Gigi. I think it's this one. Pearl, is that correct? Is this the National Center for Trans Equality was the question? Did I answer your question? Okay, Pearl says, I think so. Okay, great.
Great, and feel free to follow up with Alex or I. Our contact information is there on the screen for you all. And like I said, the more in the loop that we are with your work, the more we can represent for you when we're talking to folks at foundations.
Yep. And please, as you're, again, working on the pledge and using the pledge, feel free to reach out for us. This is an overview, right? So there's going to be questions that come up as you're actually using it and wrestling with how you might want to use it. So feel free to, again, email either of us. Happy to talk to you more specifically about what you're doing and help you plan the best use of the pledge.
Yeah. And also, we welcome your feedback. If there's anything in the pledge that you feel like is maybe a little off and could use some tweaking, let us know your thoughts. It's, this stuff is always a work in progress. We're doing our best, but obviously we're not perfect. And if there are foundations that you're working with that have signed on to the pledge and you're encountering barriers with them, let us know if there's any way that we can be supportive and help you navigate through those barriers or help those foundations be true to their intent with the pledge.
Absolutely. We're hoping to close the information loop by establishing relationships with you all so you can tell us how things are going. All right. Thank you, everybody. So that's us. You can find us here. And it was a pleasure talking to you all. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing. You all are heroes to me, and I feel like I'm totally honored to be in service of your work and you. All right. Thanks, everyone.